Well, I am so excited to be here with you guys because you guys have a really special place in my husband's heart and his life. And this is actually my first Sunday that I think I've ever been here. So thank you for having me. And thank you. So I work for World Relief. And if you guys are not familiar with World Relief, it's actually an international Christian humanitarian organization. And we work internationally, and we also work domestically here in the U.S. And I work specifically as a church mobilizer, and that is mobilizing churches like you guys to love and welcome refugees. So I wanted to start by just sharing a little bit about my story. I am Korean American. I was born in Philadelphia. My parents moved us to New Jersey, to a small suburb outside of Philly. And I grew up in a predominantly Jewish community. I mean, like, so Jewish to the point that, like, it was more synagogues than churches. And I literally thought all white people were Jewish. And I wanted to have a bat mitzvah, like all of that. But I also attended a Korean church that was next to the projects in West Philly. And our church building was actually shared with a Cambodian church. So we would have our Korean services in the morning, and then they would have their services in the afternoon. And this was really formative for me on many, many levels. The Jewish kids that I went to school with, they were all grandchildren of Jewish people that had fled the Holocaust, and they had fled genocide and religious persecution. And so those are the kids that I went to school with. And then I shared a church with Cambodian refugees who are also fleeing persecution and civil war and genocide as well. And at the same time, having a church that was next to the projects, I saw some things that were that contrasted what we were learning about in Bible study. So in Sunday school, we would learn to love our neighbors, and then if a homeless person was found wandering in the church, they'd be escorted off the property. Or our Sunday school teachers would tell us, hey, if somebody comes up to you and asks for money for a bus token, don't give it to them. And so it was like there was this dissonance, and I was like, something is not adding up. And it was really confusing for me as a kid, and trying to understand what it meant to follow Jesus. But when I looked at the Bible, I saw that it was actually really, really simple. And it says, Jesus is so clear. He says to love your neighbor, clothe the naked, feed the hungry, shelter the homeless. And it really contrasted what I saw lived out, but it gave me a path forward. So I want to start by actually reading Matthew 14:13-21. So it says, at this point in Jesus' life, his cousin, John the Baptist, has just been killed by Herod. So he's grieving, he's going away, and so I'm just going to start with verse 13. It says, when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves food. Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Bring them here to me, he said, and he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So when you look at the life of Jesus, what is so fascinating is that Jesus was not Santa Claus. He didn't ride around, like with those t-shirt guns, like at basketball games. He wasn't like shooting clothes out at people. He wasn't like passing food out, But he actually positioned his ministry in such a way that he actually like really relied on the disciples and the people that were present. So he says to them, you give them something to eat. But not like in a dismissive way, not where he's like, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed, like, oh, it's too much, But he's actually showing them, like, this is how we're going to do this. So he tells them, okay, bring them to me. So he's positioning his ministry, saying, I need you to bring what you have, and I need you to give it to me. And he's relying on those same people also to be his hands and his feet, to actually distribute what he multiplies. His ministry actually requires their active participation, and he uses like the little bit that they have. And maybe they feel like it's like, oh, it's just like, sardines and like, breadsticks, God. Like, what do you want with this, But he asked for it regardless. And he's saying that this is an integral part of my plan in this world. So again, like a few chapters later, in Matthew 15, 29, 39, he again finds himself in a very similar situation, surrounded by thousands of people. And again, Jesus relies on them. He asks them, how much bread do you have? And again, in partnership with them, he takes like the little bit that they have in their hands, he takes what they bring, and he uses it again to feed the thousands. So his plan is actually for us to bring the little bit that we feel that we have sometimes. Sometimes we feel like we have nothing, And we're like, why would God even want this like little bit that I have, But he shows us that in the kingdom, it's more than enough. And it's actually exponentially more than any of us could imagine. Today, there are actually over 80 million people around the world that have been displaced from their homes. They've been forced to flee. And this is like such a mind-blowing number, and it's hard to actually grasp. But imagine every single resident of California, Texas, and Georgia having to flee their homes and leave everything behind. But then imagine that that number actually grows every day by 44,000 people. These are people that are fleeing for their lives. They are desperately praying for safety. They're desperately seeking refuge. They're fleeing war. They're fleeing persecution, certain death, torture. They're fleeing the Taliban. They're fleeing ISIS. They're fleeing drug cartels that are kidnapping their children. And they're seeking safety and refuge, just like any of us would do if our lives were in the same danger. And it is like the most gut-level human response when your lives are being threatened and when your kids' lives are being threatened. So on Friday, I actually had the opportunity to sit with a young woman. She's 19 years old. She's from Afghanistan. And she actually received a full scholarship in partnership with the U.S. Embassy to attend a university in a neighboring country. She is incredibly exceptional and bright. She graduated high school at 16. She finished her freshman year, and then she found that she couldn't return to Afghanistan. So now she finds herself here in San Diego, alone, and she may actually never be reunited with her family. Maybe you remember what it feels like to be 19. Maybe you have a daughter that's 19 or a daughter that's been 19. But imagine yourself, or imagine your daughter or your niece or a nephew. And consider this as I read through the following scriptures. So in Leviticus 19:33-34, it says, "When a foreigner resides among you in the land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God." And then in Deuteronomy 10:18-19, it says, "He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt." And then in Hebrews 13:2, it says, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." So there's a sweet young family down in San Diego that took these verses really seriously and has actually taken in my new 19-year-old friend. They're believers, and the husband's actually in the military, and he's stationed here in San Diego. And the wife is a young stay-at-home mom. She has a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. And they just decided to open up the little RV that they have stored on their property. And so now this 19-year-old young Afghan woman is living in this RV. And she's actually been attending church with them. And she's never gone to church before in her life. She's never heard about Jesus before in her life. And she's actually going to a little mommy Bible study with the young mom. She's not a mom, but this little mommy Bible study has really taken her in. And she's actually finding a new family that God is providing for her in the midst of being separated from her family. And she's learning who God is. She's voraciously studying the Bible. And she's calling her family back in Afghanistan and telling them what she's learning. And they are learning about Jesus through her. So, as she's sharing with me about her life, she is so aware that God has really sovereignly brought her here. And she's like, I don't know why. She's like, why? She's like, I'm the baby in my family. Why would God bring me here? She was like, I'm so young. I mean, honestly, when I met her, I thought she was 14 or 15. I was stunned at how young she was. But she knew, she was like, God has his hand on my life, and he opened doors for me to come. And God has something, a special call on me, and she's really aware of that, And this is actually the story of so many of the refugees that have made it here. I mean, it is incredibly hard to come to the U.S. I know of people that have tried for 14 years that are fleeing war in their home country, in Syria, and are in a third country, and they're like, we're just trying to leave so we can be safe. So stories like my young friend, my 19-year-old friend, it is truly God opening doors and laying out the steps for her to come here. So as I sat with her on Friday and we were chatting, she just was sharing with me about her time here. And she just was sharing, she's like, I feel like my country is not a part of the real world. She said, here, in America, people worry about where their next vacation is going to be. But she said, in my country, I worry if I'm going to die today. And when I was visiting with her, she had all of her blinds drawn. And she's actually living in this rural area down kind of near Chula Vista, but fearful of leaving because that is the life that she's used to. And I told her, I was like, you're safe here. You're in the country, there's nothing really that would threaten your life here. And I told her, I was like, you need to sit outside and feel the sun in your face. And she said, is that okay? Am I safe to do that? And I was like, yeah, you're actually safe to do that, And I was telling her, her version of reality is one version of reality. And I told her, I was like, I've actually been to the border, and it's actually not that different from the reality of the thousands of people that are down there. There are so many people that I've talked to at the border that are also fleeing their homes as well because they've had children that have been kidnapped. They're fleeing the drug cartel, and they're fleeing for safety for many of the same reasons, And I was sharing with her, yes, somehow in some crazy way, we are living here in this same world at the same time, but in very, very different realities. And she explained to me, like, really simply, she said, if you live for 24 hours in my country, she said, you would be so thankful for everything, and you probably would never complain again. And it's so hard to go on living life in the same way after having conversations like this. Oftentimes when we think about missions, we think about like missionaries that have been commissioned, that have this like special call in their lives. And in some cases, this is true. Like when we think about Paul's life, God had a really special call on Paul's life and sent him out. And God does continue to send people out to the nations in the same way. But we're living in such a unique time right now where God is actually bringing the nations to our doorstep here in San Diego. And these are people that are fleeing to seek safety and refuge here. So perhaps, like maybe missions is actually just about us answering Jesus' question. How much bread do you have? What do you have to bring to me? And maybe it feels, again, like just some dried up sardines. Maybe it feels like breadsticks. Maybe it feels like raisins, But he still wants what we have. Because in his hands, he can multiply that. Maybe missions is actually just about breaking bread together, like this sweet little family down in Chula Vista, opening up what they have for God to use it. And if you look at the Bible, like throughout biblical times, this was actually one of the distinguishing characteristics of Jesus' followers. Breaking bread, radical hospitality of loving strangers. And it's how people knew that like those people were Jesus followers. And the truth is, this is actually our story as followers of Jesus. We were once ourselves far away. We were once ourselves strangers. But he broke his body, and he spilled his blood to make us family. Sometimes missions is literally learning how to love the stranger in our neighborhood. You actually learn how to live missionally by practicing it with the very people that are next door to you. Like that strange person in your neighborhood that blinds drawn, doesn't engage with people, keeps her heads down, drives into the garage. Everyone has one of those in their neighborhood. Maybe you are that person in your neighborhood, Truth, right? But the best way for us to prepare to love the refugees that are arriving is actually learning how to do this right now with our actual neighbors. And it's who we're called to be at all times, regardless of who God brings along our path. So just a few miles from here, at Camp Pendleton, was actually the birthplace of refugee resettlement in California. With the Vietnam War, Camp Pendleton was actually turned into a refugee camp for hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees. So a lot of what we see now, like in Orange County, Convoy, like Mira Mesa area, this is all evidence of what took place just a few miles from here. And it was actually churches who came around these refugees and helped them move into their apartments and helped them get connected to the community, showed them where the grocery store was, showed them how to walk to school, showed them how to use a laundromat, all of those simple things, And since 1975, there have actually been 737,000 refugees that have resettled in California and that call California home now. And right now, we actually have that same opportunity. So there are 20,000 Afghans that have actually been slated to be resettled here in California. And California is actually the top resettling state. And after California is Texas and Washington. So I want to ask you the same question that Jesus asked the disciples. How much bread do you have? And what do you have that you will bring to Jesus to multiply? So as I close out, I want to just invite you guys to close your eyes. And I just want to read the scripture over you. So this comes from Isaiah 58. Is not this the kind of fasting I've chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. So Jesus, we just thank you for this incredible opportunity that we have. God, just the doors that you are opening for the nations to flood our area. And we just ask that you would prepare us, prepare our hearts, prepare our minds, give us new eyes to see what we have, Lord. And God, I pray that you would give us just the faith and the trust to bring what we have and to allow you to multiply it, Lord. Pray that you would open up our hearts to really radically welcome in the same way that we have been radically welcomed by you, not just like welcomed into your home, but made sons and daughters, Lord. So I pray that you would give us courage. Would you help us to embrace the awkward and to step out of the boat, God? And would we allow you to build your kingdom just through our simple acts of obedience and faith? In Jesus' name, amen.